like there's a lot to be stressed about these days. There's a lot going on in the world, and it can be really, really challenging. I have spent the last 20 years of my career studying stress. I have taught a whole semester-long course on stress over dozens of times. I have worked on stress research in the laboratory, and now I get a lot of requests to comment, to speak, to give presentations on stress, and lots of that is focused on issues related to the pandemic and all of the different elements that are affecting our world at this time that are specific to stress and how it's tearing us apart and what we could possibly do about it. And I wish I had all of the answers. I wish that I could fix this and answer it for everyone. And I do spend a lot of time thinking and talking and researching about that. As I talk about stress management fundamentals with different groups, some of the things that I look at a lot are the different kinds of coping mechanisms that we can implement. Cognitive appraisals, so how we view our stress and what we or how we view events in our world and whether we interpret them as good or bad. And that's something that we'll kind of talk a little bit about today. Social support and elements of control and predictability. How in control you feel of the world around you and the situations that you're dealing with, and how predictable those events are and always have been very fundamental to our perceptions of stress. If a situation feels like it's unpredictable, then it tends to be something that will elicit a stress response. When we can take more control of a situation, when we feel in control, then we feel less stressed. That's one of the things that you can do about managing your stress. So we have these different elements of stress management. Those are just some of the fundamentals that I think about and talk about a lot. And yet, when we think about a situation where we have a lack of control and a lack of predictability, and maybe there's an element of surprise, which is like the ultimate lack of control and predictability, then that should be a super stressful, terrible thing, right? But it turns out that that's the recipe for joy, for fun, for the things that you want to spend your money and time on. So the very things that I, as a scientist, would identify as like the most stressful things are also the things that bring us the most delight. So how do we reconcile that in any way, shape, or form? I found this little graphic online, and I think it really encapsulates the way that people speak about stress and joy. I hear this a lot, like, oh, okay, so in order to feel good, to feel content, to feel happy, to feel joyful, I need to reduce my stress. And I hear that and see that a lot in advertisements for, I don't know, meditation centers and different places, and things. And while stress reduction is a really important thing, I'm questioning right now whether or not stress and joy are on the same spectrum and are at opposite ends. I'm wondering if, in fact, that's not true. And in fact, is stress actually a requirement for joy? Do we need stress in our lives? And that's the conversation I want us to have today. I'm going to start us off now with a little bit of science on some of the different elements of the stress response. And I know there's a lot here, and I'm going to break this down a little bit. So our short-term stress response, when something pops up and you immediately need to respond to it, your brain is going to appraise that situation. It's thinking about it, it's processing what in the world is going on, and it's sending signals throughout your brain. And one of the key areas that it sends those signals to is your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is sort of in the center of the brain. This little orange line is highlighting this spot in the very middle of your brain, your hypothalamus. Hypo means underneath or below, and it's actually it's right below the thalamus of the brain. The thalamus is a big central structure in your brain that's sort of highlighted here in white. So just below that is this hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a super important part of the brain that is involved in the regulation of all of your different body processes. So there are all kinds of things like your metabolism, your blood pressure, your temperature, lots of different things that are regulating how your brain, how your body is functioning. The hypothalamus, one of its big jobs is to receive all that information and then send signals. It's a traffic director. It's sending information. So one of the things that it does, it's going to send nervous signals, and so it's firing neurons action potentials to the spinal cord. So it's coming down the body into the spinal cord, synapsing there, so making connections there with neurons that exist in your spinal cord, and sending those nerve signals out to the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands are these paired structures. They sit on top of your kidneys in your back, and the adrenal glands secrete a bunch of different chemicals, different hormones, and among them are adrenaline and noradrenaline. Another name for adrenaline is epinephrine. Another word for noradrenaline is norepinephrine. Some people are more familiar with epinephrine versus adrenaline. They're the exact same thing. They were invented or discovered, in two different labs at the same time. And so the common usage has been varied in different places throughout the world. And a lot of times for some reason, we talk about adrenaline when we're talking about what's created in our body. And we talk about epinephrine as like this vial of stuff that you might purchase to have an injection to respond to an allergy or something like that. They're the exact same chemical. They're just discovered in different places and have different names. Noradrenaline is a slightly different structure from adrenaline, and it is more active in your brain than in the other regions of your body in terms of some of the things that it does. So the noradrenaline leads to increased blood sugar levels, higher blood pressure, faster breathing, faster metabolism, increased attention. So that increased attention is a lot of that noradrenaline that's more active throughout the brain versus the adrenaline. Kind of they're doing the same thing and they're released at the same time, but just a slight distinction. And it slows down digestion and lowers kidney function. Because when you're dealing with like an emergency stress response, then this is not a good time to like process lunch. It's time to like freak out. Right. Okay. So that's all a lot of the physiology of that immediate stress response. The time course here is that your adrenaline, you get this huge burst of adrenaline when we're responding to a stressful situation. Then cortisol, and we're going to come back to that diagram I was just looking at a moment ago and talk about cortisol. Cortisol is secreted in moderate levels, and what it does is it sort of supports this physiological responses. It mimics some of them, does some of the same things as the adrenaline does, but it does so in a slightly slower and more spread out fashion. So what that's going to do is that it leads to an increase. All of these things are leading to an increase of energy. It's sharpening your attention. inducing vigilance, kind of awareness of the surroundings, and it facilitates memory formation. That is the feeling of exhilaration. That's that I this is what we want, right? Like I want my energy to be boosted. I want to have my attention focused on something. I want to be aware and alert and excited, and I want to be in that moment and forming great memories of exactly what's going on, right? That's exciting. That's fun. That's important. So that's a stress response. And that's not inherently bad or bad for us. The problem is, especially in, the human-made world that we're living in, is that we don't typically encounter one stressor and then stop with all the stress for the day. And so what happens is that as we are recovering and that cortisol level is slowly dropping back to baseline, what can happen is that we have our body is that another stressor comes along and we don't have time to fully recover. We stay in this state of physiological stress. And the health consequences of that are incredible. They're incredibly bad. But if we stop for a minute, and before we get into that, and we think about these little bursts of stress where we see adrenaline spiking, we think about a typical day. So the system was what has evolved, and it exists in most animal species, and it exists to help respond to, if we imagine the zebra on the Serengeti and a lion has just popped out and is chasing it, and it needs to mobilize its energy really quickly, and it needs to have that huge burst of a response, and then it has escaped. And it can calm down and it can recover. And that typically doesn't occur on a very, more than say once a day, once a week. That's not maybe it's a constant threat, but it's not a constant living in that moment. Well, what's happened in our society is that we are activating this same system of stress for everything from, okay, I need to, woke up late and got to rush around, get the whole family ready to get out the door and be to 3 different places at once, okay, oh my gosh, a big adrenaline rush, okay, sitting at my desk, calming down maybe. And then, somebody just landed a project on my on my desk, and I've got to get that done immediately. Oh, I've got a test or an exam if you're a student. I've got to make sure to rush to pick up kids or to get dinner on the table. Oh, we don't have any food in the house. I got to head to the grocery store. Then there's traffic and road rage, and there's all these issues, right? So we're hitting that same system over and over again, and your body doesn't care that those are all different kinds of threats. What it's doing is it only has one messaging system. It doesn't have a different messaging system for the different kinds of stressors. So those messaging systems, we have the nervous system, which is neurons that are communicating through neurotransmitters, and they're sending those nerve signals that I described before from the hypothalamus to the spinal cord and out to the adrenal gland. And for this system, it's looking at the adrenal medulla, the center, the middle of the adrenal gland. And then as we look here at the cortisol pathway, we're going to start in the hypothalamus as well. And it actually secretes a little chemical that's called corticotropin releasing hormone. that, so it's actually like secreting a hormone from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which is this tiny little gland that's dangling off of the underside of your brain. It's sort of all the way underneath the middle of your brain. That pituitary gland is going to send a hormone, which is abbreviated ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, to the adrenal cortex. And the cortex is the outside. Cortex is a Latin term that means bark. So the outside of, or the bark of this structure. And in this case, we're looking at the adrenal gland. So it's the cortex of the adrenal gland, the outside. And that secretes, in response to ACTH, it's going to secrete cortisol and aldosterone. Some other hormones too. Your adrenal gland secretes several dozen different hormones into your bloodstream. And so there's a whole bunch there. But what's interesting about this system is that these two systems are a little bit complementary. We looked at the timeline already. The adrenal gland is being stimulated quickly through those nervous system responses, and then more slowly through the bloodstream. Hormones are really similar chemicals, and sometimes the exact same chemicals as neurotransmitters. But what's happening is they're being secreted out into the bloodstream. So the pituitary gland is secreting those hormones out into the bloodstream, and then they land. The receptors exist on the adrenal cortex. That secretes cortisol, which, like I was saying before, is going to do some of the same things, like increasing blood pressure, blood volume, changing metabolic functions to help support the stress response of the adrenaline. But it's going to do so over a longer period of time. Because that cortisol stays active for a long time. So for a given stressor, while adrenaline might only be active for, say, 10 minutes, the cortisol might take 2 hours to come back down to baseline, to homeostasis. That constantly elevated cortisol then is what's going to be causing, be at the root of things like cardiovascular disease, immune function disorders, kidney disorders, and any number of things. I think I stuck in, no, I didn't stick that in. I found another infographic that showed all of the terrible things that stress does to every different system of your body. And that I have many lectures on that, and it's very, very depressing. But that's some of that. Okay, so how do we mobilize the stress response that we know about for good? For why is this gonna do good things for us, right? So here's where I want to introduce you to the Yerkes-Dodson curve of optimal performance. And what this is doing is it's looking at how does stress affect our performance on things. You guys might have experienced some of this in any number of adventures that you've been on, whether it is, last minute studying or preparing for something. And what athletics is commonly studied here, where if stress is too low, you don't care about it. It's boring. It's depressing. You don't remember. So over here on the y-axis, it says performance, and we can replace that with any number of things. It could be cognition. It could be how clearly are you thinking, whether or not you remember things. If something isn't exciting or important or relevant, we don't remember it. I have no idea what I wore to work last Tuesday. No, because there was nothing necessarily, particularly stand out about, needing to wear some special thing for some special event or something like that. Right. So, but I can tell you what I wore to my sister's wedding, 18 years ago, because we remember those special things. Right. So when things are boring, and not very stressful or exciting, then we don't remember them. As we increase stress, what cortisol, the adrenaline and cortisol, it circulates throughout the body, but it's also going to be landing back into the brain. And it's going to be doing things like helping us pay attention, helping us encode memories, doing things that are going to improve our performance in a variety of different ways. However, what happens is that as we increase the amounts of those hormones in the brain and throughout the body, we begin to get to a place of anxiety and intensity and meltdown. So too much stress and we fall apart. Now, a lot of us, as a longtime college professor, I would observe that students tended to do things like procrastinate on a paper because it didn't really feel like an important deadline until it was coming up, the next day or the day, a couple of days ahead of time. It didn't feel important enough. It wasn't relevant enough. They weren't stressed out about that deadline. But then what would happen is they would put that off and then, okay, I have this time to work on it. I'm gonna get this done. And then something would happen like an argument with a roommate or a friend that they needed to take to the hospital because they had been injured, or any number of things that happened that decreased the amount of time that they had to spend on this project they had procrastinated on, and changed the value system. And then they would email me in the middle of the night and they were having an anxiety meltdown and they can't possibly finish this project on time because they had put themselves in this situation. So what happened was that they were trying really, thoughtfully in some ways. A lot of times we're like, oh, procrastination, that's just poor planning. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it is actually like a way to funnel your excitement and enthusiasm and stress into an optimal performance moment. And they would sort of plan for that, and then something would come in and change the plans, and then they would melt down, right? So this is an absolutely critically important part of how do I get the best out of myself in whatever it is that I'm tackling, get the most joy, the best performance out of myself, but not set myself up for failure, right? And so that is, if I could answer that, I'd be a billionaire. But and I can't fix that. But I can tell you that some of the tricks of the trade are to set false deadlines for yourself, or have others set false deadlines so that you can actually really feel like you absolutely have to do that. And I remember doing that during my dissertation work, is that I worked with my advisor and she would give me deadlines of like, I have to have this chapter done by this week. And I basically told her to give me that deadline, but she would enforce it. And then I felt like I had to, and it kept me working close to that optimal performance in terms of getting things done. So those are some of the tricks, some of the ways that you can do this. I read a study recently related to this, that when we get in that mode, that really thrilling, exciting mode of working and feeling challenged by our work, feeling like we are accomplishing a good amount of work and we're able to pay good focused attention on it. That magical moment happens when we're being pushed 4% past our ability level. Can't be too much, can't be too little. It has to be like, just that magical moment of like being pushed just past your peak ability level. Well, what this study was going on to say is that's almost impossible to achieve on a regular basis. And so instead, what we need to do is to be aiming within a much larger window. And even though we won't be in that magical, productive, perfect moment at every time, that we will be close enough to it that we'll be pushing our productivity as well as we can. And a really important part of that is that when we're pushing ourselves too far past, is to stop and take breaks and allow ourselves to recover. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions.
When you saw these students that kind of got stressed when they were procrastinating on papers, how do you think that affected their performance when they had that additional stress like that?
Almost always goes down. So typically what happens is that people procrastinate to make that deadline relevant, to be, to get that joy, that boost of taking a risk. And people don't always think of procrastination as risk taking, but that's a risk that we take all the time. Many of us are procrastinating on a daily basis just to like boost up that risk. Well, so what happens is that they often will get the project done mode, but typically what's happening is they get it done, but they get the first draft done. And so they haven't had time to refine it and make it excellent. So when that's another reason why those false deadlines tend to be a peak way of functioning is to find an amount of stress to get it actually finished, then have someone review, even if it's yourself, even if it's taking a break, and then you yourself are reviewing your work, and then being able to come back to it to get it actually really ready to present or turn in or something like that. Professors almost always know when they're being handed a first draft.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Franssen.
Okay, so now that we know a little bit about stress, and we've tied that a little bit to risk-taking, we're going to tie it a little bit more heavily into the risk-taking joyfulness by shifting into stress of all kinds results in similar responses. Whether those are stressful events from the external world or from your internal world, having a stomach ache is a stressor. That's all of those things. Or if we're remembering things, stress from your autobiographical memory, you're laying in bed thinking about, gee, I wish I hadn't said that thing yesterday in a meeting, or I wish I hadn't said that thing 30 years ago to a friend, that I said the wrong thing, whatever those things are that we do. All of those things come together in our mind, and our stress responses are remarkably conserved across the different triggers for stress. In terms of behavioral aspect, here they've written on this infographic, they've written avoidance, and that's fight or flight response. Typically, we have, as a species and even within individuals, a roughly 10% fight response and about a 90% flight response. So when we're responding to something stressful, we tend to draw back from it rather than approach it. Our changes in cognition as these different impacts, stressors happen, we're going to see a change in learning and memory, re-experiencing the event, changes in how we're processing information. And then our physiology, which we've talked about a little bit already today, heart rate, glucocorticoid release. Glucocorticoid is a category of stress hormones, including cortisol, which we've talked about. So thinking about all of those different things, we have kind of come together, and then we have a range of responses. Those responses are really related to each other and conserved across stressors. When we take risks, when we're doing something, whether it's physically risky or emotionally risky or socially risky, all of those different kinds of things, we're going to be using those same stress pathways, and we're going to have a lot of the same responses. So whether we're putting ourselves out there with gambling with some money, or whether that's gambling in a casino or online or on the stock markets or something like that. All of those are risks that people typically take, or and we tend to think of risk takers as people who do things that are physically risky, like jumping out of planes, or bungee jumping, or any number of those kinds of activities. But can also mean taking risks that we don't always think of, even before even in the absence of pandemic. People would, during cold and flu season, go to a party and share beverages with people that or they would do things like eating off of a buffet, right? That doesn't seem that risky. That seems like a totally normal activity until you begin thinking about common disease risks, or taking cruises and then norovirus breaks out across the cruise. That these are things that always carry risk, and we don't always think about those risks, right? And so whether it's procrastinating on paying your mortgage bill, or doing any number of different kinds of things, there's a lot of risks that we do throughout our lives. And so thinking about how do we tie all those risks in with our stress management, and what our physiological responses are, is a really compelling and interesting thought process. And to begin to think about, like, have I been taking more risks than I thought that I was? And is that changing that cortisol that I didn't realize that I was changing? Maybe taking the risk of not packing lunches the night before meant that I was at risk of being time compressed in the morning and then rushing everyone else. And then we all are more stressed in that morning time. And that then becomes something that could be managed slightly differently, right? So, but where's the balance between, but that's exciting and fun versus it's too much? And that little teeter-totter is difficult and constantly changing. The next piece of this puzzle of understanding that why risk-taking is joyful is to think about dopamine. Dopamine is one of our neurotransmitters, of which we have many, and it's one that people have heard of in relation to pleasure. Dopamine's involved in our pleasure pathways. It is fundamental to addiction, which is one of the things that we know about it, and it's really at the root of why we find things pleasurable. But one of the things that's really fascinating, and so this graphic here is looking a little bit at the dopaminergic pathway. So a lot of our dopamine cells are found sort of in the center of the brain, where there's this sort of like purple dot or circle, and then the cells then extend their branches, their dendrites and axons all over the brain in specific pathways, and secrete dopamine in those different regions that are highlighted here. So one of the things that dopamine is critical for, that we don't always think about, is it's really important for learning. It's important for learning because we have to be able to learn and recover from failure. So if we think about learning a new skill, you've ever watched someone maybe learn how to windsurf, for example, here, or maybe you guys can think of some other examples, maybe watching a baby learn how to walk, or thinking about some other skill that you've acquired. There are these moments of thrill and joy that, yes, I've got, oh no, I fell. And I think I've got this up, and I've failed, I've fallen. And yet we humans are really good at getting up and getting back to it. And we feel that pleasure so intensely, and we search for it, and we explore, and we look for that joy, that thrill, that pleasure. And so what it does is that it motivates us to keep going. And dopamine as a neurotransmitter is absolutely fundamental to this ability. And people ask, like, oh, why, if dopamine can be abused, and it's at the root of addiction, why do we even have that? And it's the, I want to search for something new. I want to try a new food. I want to seek a new place to live or work, or new people to meet, or all of those things, all of the things that make us human, and help drive us to keep looking for more. All of that is coming from this essence of dopamine. There is a moment right before we acquire a reward, right before you get the reward, that dopamine levels are actually at their highest. And we actually are the most rewarded, the most excited, the most experiencing even more pleasure than once you have received that reward. I found a couple of different quotes about this today. I was looking around to find a couple that are different from the ones that I've used in the past, and I enjoy this. There's no such joy in the tavern as upon the road thereto, which is Cormac McCarthy. Anticipation of pleasure is, in itself, a very considerable pleasure. And that was David Hume. That sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself, Jane Austen. And anticipation is a gift. Perhaps there is none greater. Anticipation is born of hope. Indeed, it is hope's finest expression. And that's Stephen L. Peck. There are many, many more examples out there of philosophers and artists who have written about anticipation. And I think that taking risks is so fundamentally important to who we are as humans, and why it feels so great. And what's more is, I want us to think for a moment about how that can be turned against us and be used to exaggerate our stress and to feel worse. This moment in our world feels very overwhelming, and it is very difficult to manage stress. And I found several quotes, and I don't have them all written down here, but the essence is, why would we experience pain twice? When you anticipate something negative, then you experience it more than once, as opposed to when you're experiencing something positive, when you anticipate something positive, you experience happiness twice, right? So when we spend our time scouring the news, paying attention to all of the negatives, thinking about all of the potential negative consequences of things that are going on, then we're spending a lot of time anticipating negativity. And what happens in the brain is that we actually forge these pathways, and we put those things together into some super difficult connections, so that what we're doing is we're creating a memory of something bad without even having experienced it, just from reading about it, talking about it, listening to it. And so what I want to think about from some of the risk takers is to, and some of this literature, is to think about taking our stress levels, which may feel like they're on maximum, and ratcheting them downward so that we can balance our mental health and be happier. So with that, I'm gonna stop here. There's tons of things to talk about in terms of thrill seeking and exploration, stress, pleasure, and so forth. So I'm happy to answer questions or to elaborate on anything that anyone would care to talk about.
When you experience the same sort of stress over time, does your cortisol response like change with age, or can you get used to the same kinds of stress if you experience it repeatedly?
We do have changing stress responses over time. Our both in our physiological stresses and our stress responses, cortisol changes over time. The way that our bodies function change over time. Some of that does exist. In addition, we tend to acquire a variety of different behavioral responses that we change and adapt to over time. So when it's something like, do we change and grow from experiencing stress, the same stresses over and over? Well, yes and no. It typically, yes, we will, because we'll change how we respond to it, or we know that it's going to be okay, so we don't worry about it, right? So that and it doesn't become a stressor anymore. But if we aren't constantly learning, growing, changing how we're responding to those, then we can still have just as much of a stress response. One of the things that can happen is that we have this like increasing cortisol, like we talked about that line. I can pull that up again. And what happens is that when we do something like take a big risk, like go do something really exciting, what we might be able to do is to reset all of our stress responses. So if what we could do is like sort of swamp out all those little like day-to-day stresses, which have been like, kind of in this mid-level, and then we do something really exciting, really stressful, really big, maybe what we can do is blast that apart and then reset at a lower level. And that can be something to kind of shake up many of us. Then that doesn't always work, and it's not always possible. So, but it's something I've talked about with a couple of different researchers, thought about.
So, just to kind of follow up on that, if someone, say, enjoys jumping out of airplanes, will their brain respond the same way on the 50th jump as it did on the first?
Well, I appreciate you asking that. So Jim is nudging me to show a couple of pictures of a younger, wilder me hopping out of some airplanes. And I found a few pictures. So what happens is that as someone is repeatedly jumping out of planes, is that they are learning all of the different elements of that, that this is something. You have this huge stress response, and the stress response is conserved and everything. But then you land and it's fine, and you lived and you were okay. And then you do it again, and the stress response actually comes down a little bit. And as well as the pleasure, as well as that dopamine. So both that cortisol, the adrenaline, the cortisol, like that short and long-term stressor, but also the dopamine comes down a little bit. And it's not quite as exciting. There's not quite the same anticipation. So then, over time, what happens with skydivers and other consistent risk takers is they begin to take bigger and bigger risks. And so then they'll do things like jumping with a smaller parachute, or taking other related risks around skydiving, so that it makes it more thrilling, more pleasurable, more exciting, and so forth. And the same thing happens with like most people in their everyday risk taking, is that that wasn't such a big deal to wait till the last week. I'll wait till the last day to do this. And so people do this in their day-to-day risks.
Could that kind of thrill seeking because of the responses you get in your brain chemistry, is that something that could be habit forming, do you think?
I mean, yes, it's habit forming for but the question is, like, is that habit forming? Is it addictive? Is this, like, are these adrenaline junkies, these, wild people that, jump out of planes over and over again and do more? Yeah, I mean, the fundamental description of what I've just said about, like, that there's this sort of adaptation to the stress response. That's learning and habit forming, and all of that is at the very core of what it means to become addicted to something. Now the question is, I mean, the thing is that we're all doing that all the time to all of the things. We're becoming habituated to the things that we're experiencing on a regular basis. So then the question is, when is that a negative habit, and when is it a positive habit, and when is it just a fine, normal, like, kind of part of our day kind of a habit? And it's negative if that's taking away from other things in our lives, such as, it costs a lot to be a skydiver. So, like, not having enough money for, food or a decent apartment or something like that. Then all of a sudden that is a habit that's causing some negative repercussions in life, versus other habits, and becoming habituated to certain circumstances can be not so bad.
By being exposed to things that cause you this sort of brain chemistry response, is there a way you can kind of habituate yourself to the stimuli, like being exposed to like snakes or spiders or something like that, to cause a really strong response?
Yeah, that is absolutely, that can be used a lot for people who have very extreme responses toward things like snakes and spiders. Then you can, introduce them to these things, um, and in very small percentage, like very small ways. So things like, okay, here's a jar, and it has like a 20% chance of having a spider in it. Just hold the jar. So that's it. They don't have to open it. They don't have to look. They're just gonna, like, hold this, like, opaque jar, and you don't even know if it has a spider in it or not. And so then gradually habituating to that, and then diving into that, is a and then moving slowly toward something that, okay, now hold this opaque sealed jar that 100% has a spider in it, but you aren't coming in contact with it at all. You don't have to look at it, you don't have to see it, but, I mean, there's a bunch of different really cool ways that people are able to use that same thing. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, well, I didn't have as big of a stress response to this one, so now I can step to the next risk, and the next risk, and the next risk, and gradually amp that up.
All right. Thanks very much for everything, Dr. Franzen. I'm afraid we'll have to bring it to a close for today. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks once again to Dr. Catherine Franzen for helping us discover more about our world and what's going on inside our brains. Please join us next week on Wednesday, October 13th at noon for RVA Air Community Science Findings. This is the result of a community science project that we did. We recruited citizen scientists to take air quality samples around the city of Richmond. And our community science catalyst, Mr. Devin Jefferson, will be presenting those findings next Wednesday. So join us Wednesday, October 13th at noon for RVA Community Science Findings, presented by Devin Jefferson, our community science catalyst. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you all for joining us.